Thanks for joining us tonight. We're so thrilled to have Jennifer with us. And Jennifer, we are so pleased that you agreed to prepare this presentation to get everyone excited about the Kitsch show and the call for entry. We really appreciate you being here and welcome everyone to the evening. I hope you all have a great time. I'd just like to introduce Jennifer before she starts her presentation. Our presenter this evening is Jennifer Salahub, a professor emerita of art and craft histories at Alberta University of the Arts. Her BFA and MA in Canadian art history were awarded by Concordia University in Montreal, and she received her PhD in the history of design from the Royal College of Art in London. Before moving to Calgary, she taught history at Concordia University, University of Ottawa, and Montreal's Marianopolis College. She is active in a number of professional societies, lectures, and publishes internationally, is on the board of the Alberta Craft Council, and is on the editorial board of Ornamentum, the magazine for the Canadian Society of Decorative Arts. Jennifer was a recipient of the Tom McFall Honor Award in 2018. She's served on the Alberta Craft Council board since 2010. And with that, Jennifer, we'll let you take it away.
It always sounds so simple. Take it away. All right. Does that look reasonable? Okay. All right. It's kind of exciting. I want to thank everybody for inviting me. And I have been down so many rabbit holes, I cannot believe it. All right. The Alberta Craft Council, I'm going to be reading. I have 20 pages of notes. I promise not to go over my time. The Alberta Craft Council has put together a call for kitsch, craft so bad that it's good, and the powers that be have kindly asked me to weigh in with an academic overview of kitsch and then provide some of my own crafty insights, all with the intention of providing fodder, nuggets of information that just might feed into your own pandemic-informed foray into the world of kitsch. Nuggets that inspire craft that is not so much so bad that it's good, but so good but that it's bad. Just what is kitsch? And this is a question I want you to think about, right? I am going, Jenna, is there any banner across my screen, or just you have the whole screen? You don't have a banner across it? Okay, good, thank you. I have a banner and I have this horrible feeling you can't see stuff, but that's all right, I don't care. All right, so I want you to think about this. What was bad taste when you were very young? Not recently, but when you were young. What did your mom say you couldn't wear? Was it fabrics? Was it color? Was it horrible things that were in the house? What was kitsch then? All right, so I'm going to begin tonight with a brief history of the origins and then the history of kitsch. And in doing so, I will introduce you to several of the more noteworthy art theorists and philosophers who have given kitsch form, for it is a constructed identity, and a few of the lesser known individuals who, to my mind, have given kitsch the personality we love to hate or hate to love. We will start in Germany, we will follow a garden gnome to England, and then we will see how mid-century culture wars launched kitsch as we know it today. Now, when I began this project, I was reminded, when I went online, I naturally went to Wiki, which I will not let my students do, to see what it said about kitsch. All right. So a number of years ago, a friend's young son was visiting our house and said to his mom, "I see Jennifer everywhere, but where is Dennis?" This research has me revisiting the objects that surround me, well, us. And as a result, I am including not only textbook cases, but a few personal kitsch case studies to illustrate how expectations regarding kitsch have evolved and changed, and how this research led me to examine my own relationship with kitsch, bad taste, and irony. So the figure on the left was actually Wikipedia's example of kitsch, and lo and behold, I have exactly the same teapot on my shelf, and I'd never considered it kitsch. So now I am rethinking my life. Whenever I begin a research project, I first turn to my old 2-volume compact edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. It's compact in the 16,000 pages. Each page has got 4 pages on it. The OED is an etymological dictionary, provides not only a myriad of definitions, but also a history of the word's usage. Thus, one can quickly learn how words have changed in meaning over time. For instance, when did kitsch become cool? So I looked up kitsch. It wasn't there. There was no kitsch in my dictionary. My dictionary has never let me down. Of course, definitions of kitsch are to be found on online dictionaries, and it turns out more recent dictionaries. However, even there I was somewhat bemused, for the newer OED listed the earliest usage as 1926, and I knew it was in use much earlier than that. In fact, the first reference was about music, and it was only in 1939 that they referenced art, and that would have been Clement Greenberg's Kitsch and the Avant-Garde. Then realization hit. Of course, the OED is limited to English usage, and kitsch identity did not start in England or America. At the same time, I was rather charmed by the definition of kitsch as characterized by worthless pretentiousness. To my mind, a rather marvelous aspirational title or goal for anyone self-consciously crafting kitsch today. And I'm hoping this talk will give you some ideas and some notes. If works of art were judged democratically, that is, according to how many people like them, kitsch would easily defeat all its competitors. Despite its status as a source of pleasure for a mass audience, kitsch is typically considered a negative product and used as a pejorative statement. It is seen as a type of creation that reaffirms rather than challenges the collective norm. A source of sheer entertainment in opposition to the elevated perception generated by high art. And yet it has been and continues to be the subject of an ongoing and engaging discourse. And like the craft conversation, the kitsch conversation is a moving target. Donald Featherstone actually created the pink flamingo in 1957. I was down more rabbit holes. And what's even more frightening to me is that he and his wife had dressed in identical clothes for more than 35 years. Kitsch. Just as the notion of truth requires falsity, so the very notion of good taste in art necessitates the existence of bad taste and consequently bad art. But bad art, like falsehood, comes in many varieties and subject to different kinds of objections. But the nature of its badness is just what makes kitsch philosophically interesting. Although kitsch is associated with bad taste, there is more to it, just like there is more to Charlie the Tuna's good taste. For those of you who are not familiar with the old Starckist advertisements, a quick introduction. Charlie the Tuna first appeared on television screens across North America in 1961. Charlie was a hip tuna who was determined to impress Starckists by proving he had good taste. And to this end, he sported an artist's beret and is portrayed listening to classical music or, as on the left, creating modern art. After Charlie made his case, the animation would end with the catchphrase, "Sorry, Charlie," and a voiceover saying, "Starckist doesn't want tunas with good taste. They want good tasting tuna. And that is what we want from you. Craft that is over the top, like Charlie himself. So bad, it's good." And I had no idea he was such a cult figure. This is Charlie on the left with a piggy bank, now a lamp, and on the right, you can get cufflinks. But now the construction of identity into its German roots. In fact, the term kitsch, like the phenomenon itself, is modern, dating only to the 19th century. Though its etymology may be ambiguous, scholars generally agree that the word kitsch entered the German language mid-century and gained common usage in the jargon of Munich art dealers in the 1860s and 70s. It might come from the German word verkitschen, to make cheap, for it was used to designate cheap manufactured objets d'art and prints for an emerging group of enthusiastic consumers, the middle class. Those whose very lack of culture would invariably lead to bad choices and bad taste. This is an inkwell, and I want you to sort of think about High Victorian, although this is German. Before kitsch, there was certainly bad art, but it was the art of the dilettante. someone that cultivates an interest without any real commitment or knowledge. Works that fell short of perfection. Taste was synonymous with good taste. Bad, that is corrupted taste, wasn't a problem. If you were well educated, you had taste. And if you weren't educated, you weren't likely to have an opinion on these matters anyway. So class implications, different classes, social classes, are not hard to recognize in the analyses of Kitsch. From its introduction, Kitsch would be used to describe both the objects and the way of life informed by mass production and consumption that validated them. And I did find a definition in my OED for taste, which I thought I should include, all right? Just so you know that my OED is not a complete loss. By the first decades of the 20th century, the term kitsch had been adopted and was in use internationally and was applied to music, literature, and the visual arts. The word was the same in all languages. They didn't change the word. And it was applied to visual arts considered to be in bad taste or overly sentimental or melodramatic. So when did kitsch as a concept become of interest, something worth discussing? Although the term was in common use, kitsch only garnered theoretical momentum in the early to mid 20th century, at first as a German speciality, and later when it was taken up by English-speaking art critics, theorists, and academics. I don't expect you to read all of these references, but I just put them in as sort of a space holder. And this is a small Hummel figure. A consideration of this history shows how kitsch has become both the product and subject of academic discourse in recent years. The rather loose concept of kitsch engaged first with German art critics and the broader public in 1909, when the State Craft Museum in Stuttgart, so it's the Craft Museum, mounted an exhibition of objects that they said testified to the distortion of public taste, right? This was a year prior to Adolf Loos's Manifesto on Modernity, Ornament, and Crime. If you've not read Ornament and Crime, or you weren't in my class, I suggest you read it. I just suggest you read it. The German philosopher and social critic, Walter Benjamin, writing in the 1930s, approached kitsch from a different perspective than the one that we normally find in American writing. His is rooted in the 18th century notion of aesthetics, and he argued that the ability to judge a work of art, with a capital A, was grounded in the notion of disinterested pleasure. And disinterested pleasure is sort of art for art's sake, pleasure in beauty that is detached and desire-free. Right? See, look, we've gone through some pages. Okay. Unlike most of the 20th century theorists, Benjamin, all of the scholars say Benjamin, they don't say Benjamin. So I am following suit. Benjamin did not rely on the opposition of kitsch and high art. Rather, he argued that kitsch, unlike art, lacked all critical distance between the object and the observer. For Benjamin, kitsch, quote, offers an instantaneous emotional gratification without intellectual effort, without requirement of distance, without sublimation. What I enjoyed in rereading Benjamin was that he provided what my students would always demand, an example. And it's sort of a pandemic example, an example. Simply, he explained, art in the exalted sense begins at a distance of 2 meters from the body. But now in kitsch, the world of things advances on the human being. It yields to his uncertain grasp. Kitsch does not have the austere remoteness of classical works of art. And this absence of reverential distance, that 2 meters, also means that kitsch provokes another kind of intimacy. Kitsch is art with a 100% absolute and instantaneous availability for consumption. Nonetheless, even if not exalted art, and it required no intellectual effort, kitsch was by the 1920s being regarded with suspicion as a serious threat to the status quo and would soon be the target of attack. In 1925, the first book dedicated to kitsch was published in Germany, Fritz Karpfen's Kitsch, A Study of the Degeneracy of Art. And shortly thereafter, the descriptive degenerate was adopted by the Nazis for both their racist agenda and their controversial stance on modern art. And this is a rabbit hole I fell down. In 1933, when the Nazi Party seized power, the Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, passed the Law for the Protection of National Symbols, which would become colloquially known as the Anti-Kitsch Law. In German, Anti-Kitsch-Gesetz. I got that wrong. Citizens were called upon to be sensitive to any artifacts, to any artifacts whose presence may prove damaging to the Volk. There were no specific definitions of kitsch given, but it was forbidden to make public symbols of German history, the German state, the national awakening in a way that was likely to insult a perception of the dignity of these symbols. A symbol was only allowed when the object itself or its purpose was seen to have an inner relationship with that symbol. Obviously, these Christmas balls would have been destroyed if somebody had come across them. Hence the ban on the kitschization, and there's actually a German word for that, of national symbols, which might lead to their debasement. A deliriously long list of inappropriate representation of symbols was provided for guidance. On that list, handkerchiefs with images of presidents of the Reich and the Chancellor. Well, let's face it, you don't really want to blow your nose on the president of the Reich. Ties, purses, notebooks, pocket knives, lighters, plates, cups, dinnerware of any kind, dice, games, kites, even food, any item bearing in whatever form one of the symbols, i.e. the swastika. Thousands of articles decorated with swastikas were destroyed, from wrapping paper for soft cheese to silk pillowcases featuring the Fuhrer's country home. And I admit there was one thing on the list that I rather lusted after, an embroidery pattern of Hitler feeding deer. On the other hand, its accessibility and broad sensibilities, it was recognized that kitsch could be adopted by political powers to manipulate and control the masses. The American art critic, who we'll talk a little bit about later, Clement Greenberg, writing in 1939, would argue that the encouragement of kitsch is merely another of the inexpensive ways in which totalitarian regimes seek to ingratiate themselves with their subjects. Think. Benjamin, a German Jew who had taken refuge from the Nazis in Spain and then France, believed that the masses could take advantage of a new form of artistic production made possible by modern technology to transform the existing power structure, using kitsch as a weapon against the self-alienation wrought by fascists. So, as a treat. This is a Hitler pin cushion. And it was sticking a pin in the axis, which I rather liked. It's an American pin cushion, and they're out there. And we have certainly seen targeted kitsch recently. I'll recognize those. And then there's my favorite website, which I have never considered kitsch, but perhaps yes. My first object I got from this website was my sister sent me a Van Gogh doll, and his little ear rips off with Velcro. And I have stunned generations of students by ripping off his ear. All right, now more on to a more familiar case study. Kitsch in the garden gnome. During the past few weeks, I have become seduced by garden gnomes. I would like to think it is because I am looking forward to spring and gardening, and not that I have simply been smitten by the epitome of kitsch. The garden gnome had its roots in German tales populated by household and garden sprites or little folk. But they were only manufactured as larger figures, 30 centimeters to a meter, 1 to 3 feet, for the wealthy in the 19th century. They arrived in England in 1847 when Sir Charles Isham brought 21 terracotta gnomes to garden and place them in his garden at Lamport Hall in Northamptonshire. So this is not the gnomes. The only gnome we have left is nicknamed Lampy for the garden. This is the terracotta gnome. He is insured for £1 million. Right? Charles Isham's daughters actually threw out all the gnomes. They were very embarrassed by them, and they didn't see this one. This is why he survived. Okay, in the early 20th century in England, so they were very popular in Germany. They're going to be very popular in England and France and Europe. They're going to lose some of their popularity directly following both wars because they're going to be thought of as German, so they kind of lose a little bit of power there. But in the early 20th century, Sir Frank Crisp, the owner of the second largest collection of garden gnomes. Now, you cannot tell me that someone is the second largest collection and not tell me who had the first collection and the largest collection. I was unable to find that person. One of my friends suggested the Queen, but I don't think so. They had approximately 100 gnomes in his Henley-on-Thames estate, and he opened it to the public between 1900 and 1919. And it would be day trippers, people paying their few pennies to go travel, look around this wonderful 130-room house and garden, or at least the garden. Day trippers fell in love with the garden and its gnome population. And as interest in gardening grew, as we had more leisure time after World War II, their popularity grew as well. And Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which was brought out before or during the war and then after the war, really added to their popularity. And as Wiki explains, and I'm quoting, more working class people were able to purchase them. Now, Friar Park. Friar Park is where the gnomes were, and Friar Park was the home of George Harrison. And when he bought the house, there were no gnomes. But he got a phone call, or rumor has it he had a phone call, and someone said, I have the gnomes. Are you interested in buying the gnomes? And he said, sure, why not? And they brought back the gnomes, threw them on the lawn, and he had his photograph taken there. And that is the cover of his first single album after the Beatles broke up. So gnomes in history. And their popularity now, kitsch is now regarded as a form of reverse snobbery. According to one authority, gnomes are very symbolic in English gardens as an anti-class statement and have been associated in England with the landscapes of the not so rich and unfamous. So frowned upon are they by the Royal Horticultural Society that they have banned garden gnomes from the Chelsea Flower Show as inappropriate mythical creatures. 2013 was the only year they allowed them in. It was a centennial, and they allowed them for the 1 year, and then they were no longer welcome. Now, I do not have a gnome. I had no idea you could watch videos of how to make your own gnome. And the gnome artist is wearing a beret and waving his hands. You can do concrete gnomes. And I actually included the name of the person who's running this website and her image, right? And then I talked to my sister about, oh my God, I've discovered I'm surrounded by kitsch. My house is full of kitsch. Pat, I am just surrounded by kitsch. And she sent me a picture of her Duck Dynasty gnome. So I think it could be genetic. So good that it's bad. So now, kitsch and the law. Today, there is a German law that states Nazi symbols are not allowed to be used in public. Thus, when the contemporary German artist Ottmar Hori, who was born in Japan, included a Hitler salute as part of an installation, an art installation, the work was removed from the gallery. However, the case was thrown out when the judge ruled that the artistic sphere in this case was found to supersede Germany's criminal code. This was satire. The statue was meant to ridicule and not identify with Hitler and National Socialism. Okay. In 2009, when The Guardian described Hori's new installation, Dance with the Devil, it began with the words, pint-sized, plastic, and the height of kitsch they may be, but no one in Germany would think twice about seeing a garden gnome, given that there are 25 million of them across the country. However, much of our understanding of kitsch today is tied to the mid-20th century culture wars that were being fought in America. In 1939, that's second list on my Oxford English Dictionary, second entry, The American art critic Clement Greenberg published Avant-Garde and Kitsch in the Partisan Review. With this article, Greenberg established himself as an art critic intent upon making distinctions between superior and mass culture. His preoccupation with aesthetic hierarchy manifested itself in different ways throughout his work. However, there were only two possibilities available to the artist. Either you belong to the avant-garde, challenging the old way of figurative painting, or you produce kitsch. Greenberg characterized kitsch as rearguard art in diametric opposition to avant-garde art, and he defined kitsch, which he saw based on marketability, broadly to include jazz, advertising, Hollywood movies, and commercial illustration. Okay. Like others of his intellectual circle, Greenberg exhibited a frank disgust for American middle-class taste, which he perceived as rapidly appropriating authentic culture for mass consumption. This two-page spread was published in April 1949 in Life magazine and is, I hope, a tongue-in-cheek visual summary of contemporary attitudes. 1949, 70 years ago. On the left, highbrow, upper middle brow, lower middle brow, and low brow, right? It covers everything from clothing to salads. You should note that coleslaw is lowbrow. But if you were looking at the sculpture, which is on the right in pink, you will discover that the top one, the highbrow sculpture, is Calder, non-figurative work. Upper middle brow is the abstracted figure. Lower middle brow is our front yard sculptor, no name artist. That would be our gnomes. And lowbrow, the parlor sculpture. And what we see here is a realistic art, we would recognize, appropriated Venus de Milo with a clock in her stomach, right? It's a rather wonderful page. Now, I tried to find the Venus de Milo with a clock in her stomach, and I managed to find movies. And what we have here is Spencer Tracy, and it was the wedding gift. It's both in the Father of the Bride when it was first made in 1950 and in 1990 when it was remade with Steve Martin. And there is our Venus de Milo with her clock in her stomach. Okay. So for Greenberg and those of his ilk, the growing popularity of kitsch was seen as a threat to the last vestiges of high culture in modern society. Although attitudes towards kitsch may have changed, the British artist and academic Colin Painter points out that even to this day, in the majority of both middle class and working class homes, there tends to be a shared dislike for and a suspicion of contemporary art, which offends notions of common sense and skill. The expanding distance between high art and daily life, reflected in the growing elitism of abstraction, consigned art to the province of the privileged few who, with time to cultivate their perceptual abilities, could approach avant-garde works with a trained eye or ear. It's that training that allowed them to see what great art it was. On the left is a Marion Nicol. By comparison, kitsch was regarded as cheap and vulgar and would appeal to the uneducated. While Greenberg was not directly responsible for establishing the hierarchical distinctions between art and craft, his influence has certainly established and perpetuated the perception about how art, his with a capital A, and craft, mine with a capital C, operate in the 20th century American culture. In his review of the Modern Museum of Art's 15th anniversary exhibition in 1944 of Art in Progress, Clement Greenberg revealed not only his awareness of the growing visibility of craft within the art world, but he also expressed his disapproval of what he called its artistic pretensions. Greenberg's power as a critic and authority on modern art established kitsch as aesthetically undesirable, not suitable for cultivated people, and identified as low culture. He claimed, there has always been on the one side of the minority of powerful, and therefore the cultivated, and on the other, the great mass of the exploited and poor, and therefore the ignorant. Formal culture has always belonged to the first, while the last have had to contend themselves with folk or rudimentary culture or kitsch. One of the prevailing ideas of the modernist avant-garde was to distance itself intellectually and aesthetically from the banalities of everyday middle-class life. They saw the domestic as at the antithesis of art, dismissing kitsch and craft as the knickknacks of middle-class homes. The rhetoric was not limited to North America. The Austrian modernist writer Hermann Broch, writing in 1950, identified the parasitic feature of kitsch as its fundamental iniquity, that grossly unfair behavior iniquity, calling kitsch the enemy within and the evil in the art's value system. Further, he compared the difference between art and kitsch to the absolute schism between good and evil. The Antichrist looks like Christ and acts and speaks like Christ, but it is all the same Lucifer. I think that would be a rather good thing to work towards. Okay. I thought I'd give you some light material. These are Wally birds, 19th century, 4 brothers making them. I wouldn't say that they're kitsch, but oh, they are. On the other hand, it is argued that by providing comfort, kitsch performs a denial. It glosses over harsh truths and anesthetizes genuine pain. Kitsch is art that is deliberately designed to move us by presenting a well-selected and perhaps much edited version of some particularly and predictably moving aspect of our shared experience. I'm calling it the beating heart of kitsch, sentimentality and emotional response. Kitsch tends to mimic the effects produced by real sensory experiences, presenting highly charged imagery, language, or music that triggers an automatic and therefore unreflective emotional reaction. We don't have to think about it. We can stand 2 yards away from it, 2 meters away from it, and we will have that reaction. So when we start looking at different kinds of kitsch, paint by numbers, they appeared in 1950. In fact, the man that developed them, and they actually were sort of invented, Dan Robbins just died a couple of years ago. His motto was make every man a Rembrandt. Right? And I sort of equate these with the needlepoint pictures of great masters that you can now find in charity shops. At the same time, it should be remembered, it must be remembered, that the problem is not that kitsch is always badly done. Indeed, some kitsch may be highly professional and keenly aware of the artistic and cultivated traditions in which it gains its appeal. Indeed, some kitsch may be flawed by its very perfection, its technical virtuosity, its precise execution, its explicit knowledge of the tradition, its timelessness, and the fact that it stimulates the very best emotions. But the best emotions seem to be the worst emotions where art, with a capital A, is concerned, and it's better shocking or sour than sweet. Right. Now, for instance, there is no doubt that the Victorian painter, Edwin Landseer, relied on emotions. This is the Old Shepherd's Chief Mourner. It was created to elicit a conditioned response from a broad audience. Greenberg would state kitsch is a vicarious experience and faked sensations. But this artist, with much of the Victorian rhetoric of the painting, it was done in the Victorian era, my students more or less dubbed the awe factor, because whenever I would put on one of these images, the whole class would sort of go, oh. Milan Kundera calls this key quality of kitsch the second tier. Kitsch causes 2 tiers to flow in quick succession. The first tier says, how nice to see children running in the grass. The second tier says, how nice to be moved together with all mankind by children running in the grass. It is the second tier that makes kitsch kitsch. Now, examples of kitsch may be particular to a certain time and place, or they may be universally applicable. Norman Rockwell's covers for the Saturday Evening Post romanticized post-World War II America and have themselves become victims of kitchification. So we've got the self-portrait on the left, we've got a ceramic plate, we've got a maquette, and we've got a ceramic sculpture, model sculpture. In the early 21st century, the epitome of kitsch, to my mind, in painting is Thomas Kinkade, painter of light and also with cups and mugs. He is described as the painter of light, an American painter of popular, realistic, pastoral, and idyllic subjects, printed reproductions, and licensed products. He's proud to have made more money than practically any other historic artist. He sold most of his work on television, on those infomercials, and most of his work was sold as prints with actual touch-ups of paint by hired artists. I also brought in some of my favorite kitsch on the left. I don't see them around here very much, but I used to see them more when we were living in Montreal. The Virgin in a bathtub, and on the right-hand side, a snow globe, right? Homage to beliefs and memories. Arguably, the appeal of kitsch resides in formula, its familiarity, and its validation of shared sensibilities. Yet change was on the horizon and given voice in 1961 with the publication of Notes on Camp by Susan Sontag. Right? So the words camp and kitsch are often used interchangeably with regards to art, literature, music, or any object that carries an aesthetic value. However, kitsch refers specifically to the work itself, whereas camp is a mode of performance. Thus, a person may consume kitsch intentionally or unintentionally. Camp, as Susan Sontag observed, is always a way of consuming or performing culture in quotation marks. She puts them in quotation marks too. The camp sensibility offered a new mode of appreciating kitsch because of its excessiveness, its role-playing, its overt decoration. Individuals with camp sensibilities brought a sophistication to the understanding of kitsch, for camp judgments implied a specific way of perceiving, a trained critical eye or ear that stands on equal ground with Greenberg's elite coterie of informed artists and viewers. Not just anyone could recognize kitsch in such a discursive way. Is this not brilliant? Is this not brilliant? Is it kitsch? Is it camp? Is it kitsch working towards camp? This was something that I grew up with, knowing would never be in my house, and my mother shuddered at every move. Now she might have been quite happy with that flamingo. Flamingos, there are probably only two groups of people who buy plastic pink flamingos: those who genuinely like them and those who see them as a statement. We begin to appreciate, in some sense, and buy those things that we know are ugly by the design standards to which we have long subscribed. Kitsch is thus a category only for those in the know. It names a group of artifacts that we abhor in one sense, but in another constitute a kind of aesthetic sense of humor. All right, we all recognize that. Okay. Now, attitudes towards kitsch have become more complicated with the advent of pop art in the 60s. Now, I just brought in 3 examples and I squashed them together because I'm not teaching you a class on the 60s and pop art. So I brought in Warhol, Lichtenstein, and Oldenburg with his toothpaste tube. All right. Attitudes towards kitsch became more complicated with the advent of the pop art movement in the 60s, as artists seemed to embrace kitsch by using mass production techniques and materials to reproduce subject matter drawn from urban, suburban, popular culture, and commercial art. As well, that which was vilified was being re-examined through a different lens. What had been dismissed as vulgar was now being championed by individuals who were well aware of the reviled status of the low art objects of their affections. Remember what was said about garden gnomes? Extreme kitsch was celebrated as anti-class or in-your-face statement. My husband has always threatened to bring one of these home. And I was muttering to my sister about this the other day, and kitsch, of course, and she kindly pointed out to me that our grandfather had a copy of this painting on his walls. And this is when I really started to wonder if it was a genetic condition. Now, it was only in the early 70s that we see mention of kitsch in the Calgary Herald and the local newspapers, and it continues to be equated with bad taste, not irony. In 1970, the author of On the Road with Young Canada remembered the North Shore of Quebec for its, and I quote, knick-knack stands by the roadside, filled with grape juices and souvenirs of stupefying ugliness, cherubs and pink pigs and general kitsch grossness. The following year, a 3-page spread in the Herald's weekend magazine focused on the confusing world of modern art. This is 1971. It was entitled Art Galleries Are a Great Places to Be Caught Dead In, and provided a guide to how to appreciate modern art, how to visit an art gallery, how to purchase art, how to hang art, but most insightful, at least tonight, is the semi-serious list, I hope it's semi-serious, what not to buy. A list that few in 2021 would find problematic. It was titled Pictures of Kids and Animals with Big Eyes Are a No-No. Art connoisseurs will snub you if you buy pictures of children or animals with endearingly enlarged eyes, any portrait in which a tear, the wet kind, is visible, pictures painted on black velvet. And as I said, I found a lot of pictures on black velvet of Elvis, but I couldn't find ones that really looked like velvet. And the ones I found were just scary. Works such as the above, I haven't given you the whole list, which means they belong to the same family as flights of plaster geese on rumpus room walls or bronzed baby boots dangling from a car's rearview mirror. So they're all kitsch. I would say right now that for some of you out there, those plaster geese on the rumpus room walls, yes, kitsch, but even the thought of a rumpus room is kitsch, kitsch with attitude. Obscuring distinctions even further between high and low art was key to the repudiation of modernism by the postmodernists. This is the 1970s and 80s, with its heightened self-awareness, its use of appropriation, irony, sly humor, and academic in-jokes. These struck a hard blow, for modern art, if nothing else, was humorless and unable to laugh at itself. So this is Alan Jones' secretary. I brought in Philip Starck's Ghost Chair with its reference to Louis XVI and its use of new materials. The dissolution of traditional categories and the divisions between art, popular culture, and even media eroded, at least for the fine artists. Craft as art, or what Garth Clark referred to as art envy, saw the elevation of craft materials. Clay became ceramic sculpture, glass sculpture, fabric, fiber art, or hybrid forms, art forms, such as furniture sculpture and wearable art. So I just brought a little assortment in. Sorry, I want to cough and I can't figure out where my mic is. All right. These were in the auction catalog when the Bronfman collection of craft was sold a few years ago. The one on the left, ceramics, and the one on the right, carved wood. I was asked if I was going to give examples from the Craft Council in this talk, and I declined. I decided I wouldn't do that because it would be fine if I asked you if you wouldn't mind if I called your work kitsch, but I felt kind of awkward merely labeling anything kitsch that you may not have thought was such. All right. This is a walking teapot. I own this teapot. And when I went to look it up to see what its date was, because I bought it from a friend who finds weird things for me, I discovered not only were they calling it vintage, I do not think the 70s are vintage, they were calling it novelty kitsch teapot. Kitsch is a selling point. eBay, Etsy, kitsch vintage, kitschy. I told my neighbor I was talking about kitsch, and he went, "Oh, you mean kitschy." He didn't know the word kitsch. He's young. Etsy, I pity. What I miss is regretsy. But kitsch is now a selling point. In the 1980s, the theoretical voice of DIY and sloppy craft had yet to make an appearance. That's sort of a different story. But we do have work in the 90s by Taddy Devine, who really does kitsch well. These are chandelier earrings, and they really are chandeliers. And on the right, I brought in a work by Barbara Stutman. This is corsage holders coming of age. In the Victorian era, young women would have had a corsage holder and they would have had their flower in it. She felt since they are no longer going to balls and dances, coming of age would be a tampon holder. And this is what we're looking at here. What I liked about it was the fact it was using crocheting and knitting and spool knitting, what might be considered rather kitschy techniques. As well, collectibles, once valued as art, have been trivialized over the last few decades. These are Hummel figures, and I just want to give you a really quick overview. On the left-hand side were drawings and paintings by Sister Maria Innocentia Hummel. She was doing these drawings, and they caught the attention of a man who was creating ceramics in a factory, mold cast ceramics. And they inspired him, and these became the Hummel figures. The one in the middle is, in fact, a full life-size wanderer that sits outside of the factory. And on the right-hand side is a very inexpensive, I hope, Japanese copy from about the 50s that's sort of given this idea of a figurine. But these were considered collectibles. They were made in Germany, the Hummel figures, the original ones, made in Germany, collected, became exceedingly popular after World War II when the American soldiers all brought them back home as souvenirs. And then others went on to use them, to appropriate them, and to monetize them. So here we are, Jeff Koons, American, Michael Jackson in Bubbles. 1988, from the Banality series, inspired by German Hummel figures. He made 3 identical works, one sold in 2001 for $5.6 million. In 2014, Sir Roger Scruton, a noted philosopher and art rabble-rouser, wrote of the, quote, strangely enduring power of kitsch. And I'm going to quote him because I like him. The worst thing is to be unwittingly guilty of producing kitsch. Far better to produce kitsch deliberately, for then it is not kitsch at all, but a kind of sophisticated parody. Preemptive kitsch sets quotation marks around actual kitsch and hopes thereby to save its artistic credentials. Given the pithy nature of Scruton's writing regarding Michael Jackson in Bubbles, I'm going to continue to quote him. Take a porcelain statue of Michael Jackson cuddling his pet chimpanzee Bubbles. Add cheesy colors and a layer of varnish. Set the figures up in the posture of a Madonna and child. Endow them with soppy expressions as though challenging the spectator to vomit. And the result is such kitsch that it cannot possibly be kitsch. Jeff Koons must mean something else, we think. Something deep and serious that we have missed. Perhaps this work of art is really a comment on kitsch, so that by being explicitly kitsch, it becomes meta kitsch, so to speak. Right? That's what we want from you, meta kitsch. Marshall McLuhan, whose notion that the medium is the message, annulled the supposed hierarchical distances or distinctions between art forms. With its ability to mirror and manipulate reality, kitsch fits into McEwen's idea of media as an extension of the human sensorium, seeming to have a life of its own, but actually reflecting our own self-understanding. So how is kitsch seen today? Here is a more recent definition, and my lamp. Art objects or design considered to be in poor taste because of excessive garishness or sentimentality, but sometimes appreciated in an ironic or knowing way. And I think it's the popsicle stick lamp that makes it kitsch. This is made out of popsicle sticks, and I have still not figured out how to get it home from our cottage in Ontario. This is when I started looking through my shelves. This is a swan detail. Determining whether an object is kitsch always involves considerations of purpose and context. Now, is the swan doily? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it so good it's bad? Is it so bad it's good? It is crochet and red straw nose. If it was a good crocheted swan doily, it would have had a crocheted nose, but mine is kitschy because it has red straw for a beak. So what I would say is when you're looking at kitsch, consider purpose and context. And from design history, there are 3 points to consider: conception, production, and reception. So when you look at something, you figure what was behind it. This was a decorative doily from the 50s, all right? How was it made? It was crocheted. There were patterns for it. Honest to God, you can go online and find more patterns, and people seem to think it's from the 70s. It was not from the 70s or the 80s. They're thinking way back in the old days. Production, how it was made. Reception, how was it seen then? Somebody would have been thrilled with this. They would have had it on their table. All the ladies for bridge would have loved it. How was it seen in 1970? Wouldn't be caught dead with this crocheted swan in the table. You hide it somewhere, right? When I was studying in England, one of the historians pointed out to me that most of the stuff we have passed down to us is the really bad stuff that was handmade, because people didn't want to throw it out because it was made by somebody they knew, but it was so ugly they hid it and thus preserved it. All right. Reception. All right. So how is it seen today? Well, now it's back and popular and in style. And here he is with drinking straws. And when I had my tea for my students, when we would do our textile tea, I always brought him out, and it was always a very successful thing. Okay, swan doilies. Now, today, perhaps the most often cited characteristic of kitsch is that it is in bad taste, but that is not enough to make something kitsch today. There must also be an element of display. Kitsch objects call attention to themselves and their owners. Now, I phoned Julia Kruger and Yolande and asked them if I could actually use this teapot as an example. We're both not sure if it's kitsch, but she said, sure, absolutely. This is Bambi and the Hazardous Waste Teapot from around 2010, and it's on my shelf, and I love it dearly. So, although kitsch may have lost its horror in the wake of pop and postmodernism, the discourse that high modernism launched against it in the first half of the 20th century was brutal, and this negative voice continues to inform attitudes towards kitsch, whether loved or reviled, indulged or condemned. Kitsch indexes mass cultural values in a given area, while simultaneously exposing the relationship between the masses and the forces controlling production. It, like craft, finds itself afloat in theoretical discourse. Ours has become a theoretical discourse that considers historical forms and their relationship to the present. This is Rhonda Zwillinger's Kleenex box. In 1979, Clement Greenberg defined postmodernism as the antithesis of all he loved. That is, the lowering of aesthetic standards caused by the democratization of culture under industrialism. One can only surmise what he would think about IT and non-fungible tokens today. I was just glad he lived to see postmodernism. Otherwise, he's still spinning in his grave. Although I have never considered, I love this, this Kleenex box. Okay, although I have never considered Greenberg a go-to resource, he did emphasize that there was a precondition for kitsch, without which kitsch would be impossible, and this might serve us today. He argued that there must be availability close at hand of a fully formed cultural tradition whose discoveries, acquisitions, and perfected self-consciousness kitsch can take advantage of for its own ends. This is what Greenberg decries as sucking the lifeblood out of past cultures, which would prove fertile ground for your considerations. In other words, kitsch does not analyze culture, but simply repackages and stylizes it. Kitsch reinforces established conventions, appealing to mass tastes and gratifying communal experiences. Kitsch comes to support our basic sentiments and beliefs, not to disturb or question them. As a result, kitsch is easy to market and effortless to consume. I almost call this kitsch and kin. As a craft historian who has recently discovered evidence of a familial kitsch gene, I would like to suggest an alternative approach to the study of modern art, one that recognizes kitsch as an agent provocateur at the center of the revolution that shook the very foundations of modernism and continues to serve as a point of entry, or at very least a point of reference for many contemporary artists. To its credit, kitsch encourages serious young artists to consider how their work was consumed and by whom. Kitsch, like craft, fostered a renewed interest in the domestic and everyday things at the expense of high art. And while kitsch challenged traditional aesthetics, its foray into battle resulted in a renewed respect for pattern and decoration. And it did this while wielding the most potent of weapons, humor. This is why I and the Alberta Craft Council would like to see you take on kitsch on your own terms, even as you consider whose bad taste you are channeling. Like Charlie the tuna, your work should be so good it's bad, or so bad it's good. It should just be great. And these are Freudian slippers. This is also from the Unemployed Philosophers Guild. All right, and that's the end of my talk. I lost my clock under all of these papers, so I don't know if I've gone over. It's okay?